accessibility, credibility, value, bias, relevance, misconceptions, and interpretations. These are just some of a host of challenges faced by the creative and cultural sector when it comes to driving investment. Grace Meadows, in conversation with Dr. André Gouws, Kate Gardner, and Madeleine Lambert, contemplates the place of creative and culture sector research and explores how this has shifted and may continue to change, and importantly, how effective research is in encouraging investment within the sector.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Day One's third session in the inaugural PASA Assembly. So this session is part of the business and research stream. So this is going to tackle the relationship between the private and creative sectors, investment in the creative sector, and the myths, biases, and misconceptions that may hinder this, the place of research and the relevance and influence of different voices and interpretations, and how effective communication, research, cultural sensitivity, and this intelligence we speak of, and harnessing the unique strengths of these two sectors may help them cross boundaries and collaborate meaningfully. My name is Grace Meadows, and I'm a cultural producer and arts program manager, and it is going to be my pleasure to facilitate in true assembly style, a slightly different panel for this afternoon, and we're going to do this interview style, looking specifically at the role and value of research in the creative sector, as well as how it impacts investment in the sector, and of course, how it's funded. So joining me today is Dr. André Gouws, Kate Gardner, and Madeleine Lambert. So before we actually going to open, I'd like each of them to come up to introduce themselves, what they do, their current research areas, as well as how this aligns with the organization's outlook and strategy. And then, of course, we can open up to a broader group discussion, which I'm hoping we can square in just in 50 minutes. So welcome again to this session. And maybe if I can start with you, Dr. Gouws. Hello.
Hi, Grace. It's great to be here. Just a little bit about SACO, the South African Cultural Observatory. There's a number of cultural observatories across the world, and we kind of based on their best practice. The Cultural Observatory is a project of the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, so it's not an entity on its own. It's housed at the Nelson Mandela University, and it's got the University of Fort Hare, Rhodes, and KwaZulu-Natal as their main partners. I'm an economist, a trade economist, so when I look at the cultural aspects, especially cultural diplomacy and economic cultural diplomacy, that's of particular interest to me. But I also look at data. So the paucity of data that we have in the sector is of great concern. There are people that are collecting it, and that's what we're having a lot of fun in.
Okay, that's wonderful. So you are the repository for all sorts of research coming in, and not to oversimplify or bring down the question of what research is. You've mentioned quite a few illustrious organizations and higher education institutions that you're attached to. I want to go back to traditional forms of research, which traditionally, yes, absolutely comes out of universities. What are we seeing in the research landscape? What's coming in? What type of work is being encouraged? And who is this for?
Good question. So a lot of the research that we've been doing now has been, because the main client is obviously the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, is monitoring and evaluation. So we've been spending a lot of time on seeing how we can, what are the issues that we need to measure first of all, and then looking at how we can get the information, and then getting the information and putting them into various models. So one of the things that the Cultural Observatory has done is developed the festival impact calculator. So if anybody wants to do a festival, we can see, you put in your parameters, you put in your assumptions, and you can see what the impact will be. So it's particularly useful for local authorities. Then we've also done the mapping study where we started looking at the GDP, the size of the GDP. And then we've obviously also spent a lot of time with the policy issues. So we've looked at the white paper, looked at issues surrounding the white paper and the economic impact of it. Then other policy issues, how to promote trade, again, another favorite of mine. how can we promote the development of books and so forth. And then we've also looked at wider with the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, looking at a master plan for the creative industries. So it ranges from everything. So employment is important, trade is important, GDP is important. An area we're battling a little bit is looking at transformation. So maybe Kate will be able to give us some pointers there where we can find more information on what is happening, and then also the tools that we can use to stimulate transformation and having CCIs more inclusive.
I love that, Dr. Gouws. Thank you very much. So you opened with really looking at monitoring and evaluation, and we know that that's a really critical area, especially in the creative sector. But you've also mentioned a lot of different usages or maybe different objectives of research. So mapping, the calculator, which I know the industry and the sector at large really appreciated coming out of SACO. So that was really great. And transformation as well. So you also mentioned that you were very concerned that there's not enough data. What do you think is the challenge that is the greatest presently in the creative sector that you're seeing in the scope of landscape, in the landscape of research?
Okay, now we need to take a step back. When data is collected by the official statistic agencies, they use their methodologies that have been around for maybe 100 odd years, and those have all been determined by the United Nations at their various gatherings, but those are all antiquated. So they're looking at the old traditional sectors. So with the creative sector, it's a very dynamic field. So we do have areas, books, for example, and plays that are new, but ebooks, nobody knew anything about ebooks a decade or two ago. And where do we get that information? How do we come up with those? So those are the big challenges that we have, is the definitions of what the data is. So some data has been collected, and then just aggregating the data. So Stats South Africa, for example, have a sports, recreation, and cultural category. But how do we just aggregate that to take out the sport, take out the recreation, and that we can be left with a cultural number? And then how do we allocate that according to various what UNESCO call domains? So we look at, they've got 6 different domains, and I'm sure we'll discuss them a bit later as well. And how do we take those domains and see where are we doing the best? So we know that certainly the biggest area is in design, creative design, but we also know that's shrinking a little bit from our latest mapping study. But what about the other sectors? Should we be doing more plays? Should we be doing more writing? Where can people make more of a living? So we're looking at both the cultural aspects as well as perhaps a little bit more on the economic aspects. Where can employment be, and so forth? Where can we find new markets for products? So yeah, the biggest challenge is getting a common methodology that we can use to measure our industries.
And ultimately, that's the point of it, right? We're looking for an evidence base that will hopefully answer some of these really critical issues. Thank you very much, Dr. Gouws. I'm also happy that you brought up the conundrum, I guess, of definitions, because that's something that we battle with in the creative sector for a lot of various definitions, terms. I think it is also the skirting issue between creatives, as those antiquated conversations would have you think, creatives being more applied, more experimental, and in the business sector being very corporate and down the line. So thank you for that. I'd like to introduce Madeleine Lambert and welcome you to the conversation. It's really skirting that definition barrier between, I guess, the creative sector and business. Madeleine, welcome to the session. If you could introduce yourself, let us know what your current research are and how you navigate this path between it as we start thinking the role that research can play in investment.
Thank you so much, Grace, and thank you, Dr. Gouws. I think that was an interesting start to our conversation. I am Head of Research at Business and Arts South Africa, more commonly known as BASA. In terms of what we do, obviously as BASA's head of research, I'm responsible for monitoring and evaluation, which is very crucial. And I think that that's a key challenge that we have in the sector. So building on what you were saying, Dr. Gouws, we do have a challenge with quite a lack of data historically in the sector and having documented research in the creative and cultural sector in our country. And so I think seeing more and more organizations take monitoring and evaluation seriously and understand its purpose and how it can be used not only as a tool for reporting to funders, but to really help us understand better what the work we're doing is and what our impact is, and help us constantly improve, I think is really vital. And we have a lot of growth still to do in the sector in that area, but I'm pleased to see that we are making some progress in that regard. I'm also responsible for contributing to funding proposals, funder reports, program development and advocacy, and then obviously establishing and implementing strategies for developing and sharing our own research to position BASA as a thought leader and to support our stakeholders. In terms of our research focus, it's a lot more on the relationship between business as a stakeholder and a supporter of arts and culture, because that is our primary mandate. What we do at BASA is we work to develop the sector, but mainly by encouraging the private sector to invest in arts and culture. And so that is key for us. And a long-standing and key research property at BASA is our biannual arts track research. I'm not going to delve too much into that today because I spent a whole other session in BASA Assembly presenting our latest edition of that report. But just to give a bit of context, Arts Track looks at consumer engagement in arts and culture, as well as the perceptions of businesses who sponsor these kinds of activities. And actually, BASA Assembly was really developed around launching Arts Track and using that to stimulate conversation around some of the key issues in the sector. And one thing that I wanted to note just in terms of research in the sector, it is quite a big challenge for us. And I think that a lot of times researchers tend to lack an understanding and a sensitivity towards the sector and the challenges that we face. And also often practitioners and creative practitioners in the sector don't have an appetite for conducting the research. But more importantly, we often lack the skills and the resources to be able to do that. And so I think our conversation today around how research is funded is going to be very valuable as well. And I think also a substantial portion of the creative and cultural sector operates informally, so that also makes it incredibly difficult to track. But I do think more people, as I said earlier, are starting to see the benefits of conducting research, not only from an advocacy perspective, but building credibility for the sector as well, and understanding how we can improve our work and learn from one another and grow our impact. And I am excited to see, obviously, access to academic institutions is still comparatively limited and only certain people are able to tap into that. But I have noticed in recent years an increase in practice-led research coming through our institutions that offer arts and culture training. So that's very exciting for me. And I think it's so important for the private sector, for the education sector, and for government to understand the value of research in the sector and to enable and encourage that and use that data so that we can learn how to better serve our stakeholders and also drive investment.
Madeleine, thank you very much for that. I think that just exposes a labyrinth of ideas that research can take us to, which is really great. And you've mentioned some really critical aspects that we will be getting into, particularly around funding. But going back to the value of research and particularly skirting this ground between sector and business, what is the role of research, particularly in looking at investment for arts?
Sure, that's quite a tough question to answer. And I think that that's something that I constantly ask myself in the work that I do at BASA. But certainly from what I've seen through our own research and the work that I do, is that having data available really helps potential funders and investors get a solid sense of who it is they're looking to support and what the potential impact of that support could be. And obviously, when you are working with a funder, being able to demonstrate your impact and return on investment is vital for them. And so I think research from a monitoring and evaluation perspective is really, really important for that, because it helps you, and not just the sector as a whole, but specific organizations and specific projects, to really demonstrate what it is you do and the impact that you have so that you can show value. And I think that can be one of our biggest challenges in the sector, because it is very largely a service-based sector. We do have a lot of products available, but a lot of the creative sector is service-driven. And so that can be difficult to quantify in some ways. And very often we don't know how to quantify that and how to put those stories on paper in a way that really demonstrates what it is that we do. And so from my perspective, I think it's important to try and balance the quantitative and the statistical data with that narrative element. What I've found is very often, particularly the big corporate funders and government funders, can get a little bit engrossed in the statistics and the numerical data and the quantitative elements, which are very valuable and important. But what I've been very interested in, obviously coming from a humanities background, is the power of the narrative and being able to use the two in combination to really demonstrate your case. And the data is really important, but often what the narrative offers is that emotional connection and the real story and understanding the impact, not necessarily from a financial perspective, for example, which is valuable, but really the individual impact on human beings. And sometimes that can be very powerful in being able to spark an interest in a potential funder or investor, to be able to see that real impact and how it's changed a person's life. So, I mean, that's one element of it. But from BASA's perspective, and looking at the arts track research particularly, we have had feedback from a lot of our members, and our members range from micro enterprises right up to huge corporations, all of the big banks, the telecommunications companies, and those kinds of organizations. And a lot of our members have indicated that they do use the arts track research when they're looking at their strategic plans and looking at their sponsorship strategies. And I think particularly for the brands who are well established and recognized as supporters of arts and culture, very often the data that we find in Arts Track helps affirm their place and reaffirm why they do what they do, and that it is having an impact on their brand and their brand reputation.
Thank you for that answer to a very full question around interpretation, some of the myths, who is the audience and how do they see the role of research. And at this point, I'd like to cross over to Kate Gardner and allow her to introduce herself. Welcome to the session, Kate. I'm very interested to hear from you after you introduce yourself and the work that you do, a little bit about your research journey and what interests you, particularly on the level of impact investment and the role research has played in your programs.
Great, thanks, Grace. So my name is Kate Gardner, and I am currently a program manager with the British Council, and I have a particular interest in inclusive and creative economies. So that includes social and creative enterprises, and I'm particularly interested in impact investment. So the British Council is a cultural relations organisation, which means that we support and stimulate cross-culture, cross-border, cross-sector collaboration and relationship building. So that means that we would facilitate these moments of connection through the support of the arts and creativity, educational opportunities, and entrepreneurship and skills development. And so these are the areas where we see most of our research being commissioned. I have been involved most recently in a piece of research that looked into the overlap between operating models, funding mechanisms, ethos and values and needs of creative and social enterprises, and looking at how impact investment can get involved in that space. So for me, from that particular perspective, I think of research as a way that we just connect to our sectors. From what I see, funders who are both grant makers and investors don't have the capacity to be present in the sectors. So they rely on research to give them the big picture and figure out where they're going to be putting their money. So the creative sector hasn't received a lot of impact investment specifically. And I think that comes down to the fact that the sector isn't particularly well understood. And the investors are missing out on really enormous opportunities because the creative sector is one of the fastest growing economies in the world at the moment. And just because there's not enough information out there, impact investors are shying away from the creative industries. So, and I also think research is a way where those who are part of the sector see how they're part of a whole so that they can start to position their work differently and look for opportunities more effectively. So that's kind of how I see everything linking together.
Thank you, Kate. And also opening up bigger questions. And when we look at one of the dominant themes that are coming out of Assembly, this idea of cultural intelligence and being a part of a cultural relations agenda and using especially, and I love what you say around research as a demonstration of ethos and values, picking up what was earlier said by Madeleine around qualitative, quantitative data and how we start to see these connection points. I mean, can we look at some practical case studies? So I know speaking from the DICE program and really looking at understanding a mapping, something that Dr. Gouws mentioned earlier, but really looking at understanding the people and the ethos of the work. How does that look when research traditionally has been in a very data-driven report style writing lodged in a place like the Cultural Observatory or a library somewhere or published in a journal? How are some of those ethos, the value and connection points happening with audiences, given that accessibility in our country is also quite complex?
Absolutely. So for us, measuring values and ethos and principles was an incredibly important part of our monitoring and evaluation and really informed the research agenda behind the program. So it hit enormously well. So when we started looking at bringing that statistical data, which you see in a lot of investment reports where people are really looking for the hard numbers, when you bring in the ethos and the values, that's when you start to talk around the more human side of impact rather than the number side of impact. And it really, really gave us the space to have deep conversations with the sector and to be a lot more vulnerable about what we were trying to do. It allowed us to be a lot more innovative and a lot more experimental because we were saying upfront that the only sign of success was not statistical data. It was about process. It was about experience. And so when you build that into your M&E, it allows this very mutual relationship between the people that you're working with and the organizations that are funding that work, because they start to be involved in the process of designing what you're measuring, what success looks like, what do they need. It's a much more of a two-way conversation. And so it's been an incredibly important part of our work, and it's landed very well with the people that we're working with.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kate. And maybe at this point, I'd like everybody to come back on screen so we can open this group conversation. I know we started off looking at a few of the challenges that are happening with research and how we engage with research. And almost the default position is always to take it from the very top, right? Who is doing the research? Who is reading the research? What is the agenda of this research being done in the first place? But ultimately, and thanks for that, Kate, around engaging and what does successful research look like? So I want to talk about access and being the repository. Dr. Gouws, perhaps you can tell us how are audiences engaging with the research that is out there commissioned, and more so outside of traditional forms of research or outside of traditional forms of publication of research? What else are we seeing in the contemporary landscape?
If I can go back just one step, and it's something which Madeleine spoke about and which Kate finished on. And Kate said, what is success? And I think that's the most important. So jotted down a few things. What do we want to achieve when we're looking as economists, first of all, but also when we're doing our monitoring and evaluation? Do we want economic growth? Are we looking at technology? Are we looking at employment? Are we looking at wealth generation? Then softer issues like nation building and social cohesion, or creativity. Are we becoming a more creative nation? Are these arts programs that we're doing at schools, for example, leading to more creative citizens that can lead us. So we all know that you've got these different kinds of creativity. So you've got small C's, big C's, and professional C's and enormous C's. So maybe some of these programs that stimulate creativity could generate an Einstein, and then we'll have a brilliant narrative to tell people. So yeah, so when we get back to the kinds of things that we're looking at, those are the kind of things we've always got in the back of our mind. So when we do our research, we've always got that lurking in the background. As economists, we obviously look at the growth, which sectors show the most growth, and if they grow, are they job rich or job poor? Do they have big multipliers? In other words, will a sector, if it grows, have a lot of spillovers to other areas? So, for example, if we do more stage, obviously we're going to be making more costumes, and it will boost the clothing industry. So those are the kind of things that we're also looking at, is where can we help South Africa as a whole. So when it comes to investment, again, just looking at how we can coordinate investment. I think there's a lot of investment coming in. A lot of it's not too coordinated. And I think that might be a good database also to keep track of.
I think that's great, especially looking at the overarching sort of the trends that we're starting to see, or the biggest research focus areas or priority areas. So absolutely, undeniably unemployability and igniting and activating our youth populace in order to inspire and create those jobs is number one on a country agenda. Madeleine, Kate, any other major trending research agenda topics that are coming out in the work that you do?
Yeah, so in terms of an impact investment space, I think it's important to line up the sector-specific research that's taking place with the broader impact investment research. So the Global Impact Investing Network, GIN, produces an annual survey of impact investing every year. And last year, the 2020 report showed that there was only 0.1% of global impact investment going into the creative industries. And so that's a very worrying statistic. It's incredibly low. And I think that shows to a very seasoned traditional impact investor that they might think that there are not opportunities in the creative sector to invest in. And so that kind of report can be potentially damaging to organizations in the creative industries who are looking for impact investment. But if you start to dig a little bit deeper, and there are new reports that are coming out that are starting to unpack that a little bit more. And when you dive in, when you have people who understand the nuances of the sector specifically, and they start to unpack that work, the research that they're putting out there shows that there's a lot more impact investment going into the creative industries. It's just that it's hidden behind different kinds of impact. And so it's maybe hidden as nation building, or it's hidden as social cohesion, or even going more traditional, it's hidden as food security or something along those lines. And so that's when you need somebody to start producing different kinds of research, because impact investors are referring to the GIN report every year to see where to put their money. And they're building their 1 year, 3 year, 5 year organizational strategies based on that kind of research. And so when we start to unpack that a little bit further and we start to couple research, we see a lot more interesting stuff. And so one of the most interesting reports I've read at the moment is the Creativity, Culture and Capital report, and it was produced by Nesta and a couple of other organizations in the UK, and it's called Impact Investing in the Global Creative Economy. And so those really interesting kinds of reports that are coming out that are creating the nuance that we need to be able to make informed decisions.
Thank you for that, Kate, and some interesting references that we're going to try and put on the microsite so that everybody and different audiences joining in on this conversation can have access to. So thank you so much for that. So we've discussed a lot around how research and evidence can then inform program design. We've discussed a lot about how data can be used to inform investment and where impact investment needs to be put in. And thank you so much for those sources, Kate. My question, I guess, is for Madeleine, recognizing how expensive research is to do in the first place. So I guess I'm asking you because BASA has a whole range of really interesting and dynamic toolkits that the creative sector has come to rely on in a very big way. So as a arts practitioner, as a burgeoning arts organization, as somebody who wants to really look at a more evidence-based strategic approach to their practice in sector and starting to utilize some of these resources available, what would you advise and where do you begin?
Thanks, Grace. I think the best advice I can give is to partner or collaborate. Research can be very expensive, and I think very often researchers and organizations waste valuable resources, firstly conducting research that's already been done or that others are busy doing. And that duplication, while sometimes it can be useful to get different perspectives on the same agenda, that duplication can be very costly and waste a lot of time. And particularly with resources being so limited and funding hard to come by, I think that that's a huge, it's a huge challenge for us. And so my link to the suggestion of collaboration is also just to see what's out there. I mean, organizations like the South African Cultural Observatory, like British Council, like BASA, and a number of other institutions do this kind of research, and very many larger organizations have capacity and have resources. So start off by seeing what's available. And thanks for mentioning BASA toolkits. I also would like to just punt Vance's toolkits. They have a number of amazing ones as well that we also very frequently refer people to. So have a look what's out there. And once you get a sense of that, identify people who have similar values to yours, but also people who are interested in the same kind of data that you need to collect, and see what partnerships you can enter into. Certainly for BASA, with our arts track research, we work very closely with BMI on that. And BMI is primarily a sports sponsorship research leader, and they've branched into other areas. But what's great about that is the research that they do has a very particular formula. So they're not reinventing the wheel each time they conduct the research. They have a formula in place. And they also have a number of different stakeholders who purchase that research from them or who commission certain research. And that makes it a little bit more affordable for other people who want to access that. And so those kinds of collaborations and looking at pooling resources, I think, can be very valuable.
Thanks for that, Dr. Gouws. I just see you nodding your head. I mean, particularly around comments about duplication and not knowing what's out there and recreating the wheel. Is this something that we see often in research, perhaps at SACO?
Regrettably, yes. I think there's a lot of people, and some of them are independent, or most of them are independent, and the similar research just happens naturally. Some of it, unfortunately, is a little bit plagiarized, so you get a bit both of that. But the main thing that I heard there was partners that can do the research. And I think one of the resources that we're missing a lot of is the students. So every honors student has to do a research project, and we need to excite them into ways of doing some of this research for us. And obviously it takes a lot longer to get the information. And if you've got good supervisors at the universities, like most of the partner universities that SACO has, and a lot of the other universities have got good supervisors that can supervise the research, that there's at least quality coming out. So I would definitely say we need to focus on the universities, but then also working closer together. And I think a lot of us spend a lot of time collecting the same data, and I think we really do need to pool it and make it available to each other, and not always to treat it as proprietary. So in that regard, SACO, with its mapping study, we've published as much of the information as we possibly allowed to. And I think the provinces as well, they've enjoyed getting that information. I'm not sure to what extent the businesses or the business decisions have been using the mapping studies that we've done. but certainly I think the collaboration is critical. And then when Madeleine was talking about BMI, it just brought a smile to my face, because there's a lot of talk, and there's nothing that's been decided. I think it's just talk at this stage. The Department of Sports, Arts and Culture is now new, so they've brought sport in, and they're not quite sure if SECO should start looking at sport as well. And there's a lot of similarities. So even if you look at the UNESCO definitions, sport is included as a related discipline to the cultural and creative industries. So, yeah.
Sounds like there's exciting stuff on the horizon, and this is the nature of research anyway. So this is a critical question I'd like to ask all three of you, in fact, is how long does research last? So if we're talking about collecting data, and I ask this in the ever-changing face and the challenges that we've experienced, particularly in the creative sector brought on by COVID, but as one example, you kind of walk into a world, you collect this data, you make these partners, you think you know what you know, and then you publish, and then the world changes, and suddenly the shelf life of that data becomes irrelevant, not necessary. Everybody's doing things differently. So organizations bringing in different sectors like sport, as you mentioned, Kate Gardner, I know you always are talking about intersecting sectors, multidisciplinary approaches. Any comments from the panel around that? The contemporary relevance around research. Kate, maybe we can start with you.
Well, I'm thinking, the thought that popped into my head when you asked that question was, if the research that you're producing is really good, and if you have, if it's representative, and if it's circulated to people who are going to use it, then sometimes it's the research that changes the world. So that's how, immediately as you produce a report, it becomes out of date, because things are changing, and that's just, I think, realistic and something that we have to constantly work with. I think you want the most up-to-date research you can have, and I think a lot of the time we're seeing some of the stats you find on, like stats, say, for example, were produced in like 2012. That's obviously incredibly out of date. And so I think you want to be producing stuff quite regularly, but also what that research is going to be on is going to change constantly, depending on how things evolve out in the world and what people are interested in, and building on research that's already been done. As you do really good research, you learn new things. You never do research into an area that you're going to find out exactly what you thought was true. You're hoping to do research into an area and learn something new. And based on learning something new, that research is now out of date, but you've now opened up the new topic for research. And so I think that's where it comes down to what Madeleine is saying about collaboration. And so, for example, one organization produces a piece of research this year, and then next year somebody else can build on it. And so I think we've got to have a partnership.
Thanks for that, because at the heart of creativity is a curiosity, it's a question. It begins with a question. Any comments from you, Madeleine?
I definitely agree with you on that, Kate. And even in terms of BASA's arts track research, we release it every 2 years. And sometimes it feels like by the time we launch the new one, the old data is so outdated, and it feels like there was a very big gap in between. So definitely, and I think particularly as things become more globalized and a lot more data becomes available online and things change a lot more quickly, the more you produce research and the more you collaborate, I think the better, because, information can become redundant very quickly. And it's particularly, I think, with what's happening at the moment in terms of COVID, the climate is changing so drastically. And in the space of a year, the way we operate has shifted completely. And so I think, the more regular, the better, but definitely working together and collaborating and building on existing research for me is so important.
Absolutely, thanks for that. And also different voices, more representative voices. So thank you, Dr. Gouws, for mentioning universities and students. So we're looking at an entire year, so let's call it an honors year, master's, PhD students who are doing really interesting work. So we're looking at this constant engine of new work that's being produced to kind of fill that gap in relevance. Would you say that is some of the things to look forward to, Madeleine, that you speak about when we go to relevance and the newness of the work that we're doing?
Absolutely. And I think that that's something that for me has been so inspiring around the formation of the South African Cultural Observatory and the fact that it's partnered with academic institutions. And BASA in the past has also partnered mainly with BITS so far, but we're looking at pursuing other collaborations. And I think that universities and students are a hugely underutilized resource, and particularly for creative organizations needing to do research that have limited resources, and something that we were discussing earlier, partnering with students and with academic institutions and programs can really help you access the information you need with limited resources. And I think that that's very important, because also what you were saying about new voices, Grace, is so vital. And I think that that's something that BASA has been very conscious of in terms of how we've curated BASA Assembly. We value the voices that are prominently heard in the sector, but there are so many young up-and-coming researchers and creatives and business people who don't always have the opportunity or the platform to share their insights. And so for me, it's very important to open up those opportunities and hear those voices, but also collaborate. I think it's easy to get stuck in a mentality of, you know, I'm positioned as the expert and I know what I'm doing in this particular field. But even when I was working in education and facilitation, you're never really the expert who knows all. There's always something new to learn, and no matter who you're engaging with, I think you'd be surprised at the insights and the value of information that you can access from sometimes the most unexpected sources.
Thank you for that. And I think therein lies the conundrum, right? You know, so we want something that's rapid moving. We want longitudinal study that you really need a lot of time and patience to gather certain data. And we want commissioning houses that are not age-old institutions that move quite slowly. So I think kind of what we're talking about is really looking at research differently, both in its approach and its perceptions, looking at a few of these myths. So Dr. Gouws, to you, where are you seeing this going? Where are you seeing, how do you see in 5 years, 10 years time research being produced? Will it be in the same format? Will we be interested and open to different credible forms and methodologies of how research can be presented? How do you see this changing, and particularly how that then affects how we perceive research or utilize it?
Okay. The one thing we've always got to accept is that our human natures never change. We're always going to stay the same. We always want more. We're always going to appreciate good entertainment. We're always going to appreciate good products. So as economists, we look at the structure of the economy. And when the structure of the economy is stable, we can make forecasts. So that's where economists earn their bread and butter. What happens when we have a structural break like we've had now with COVID and things have changed, that's when it gets exciting for economists. So we do like these structural breaks to see what is happening. Are people moving to ebooks? Are people using these online platforms to do conferences? Will those carry on after COVID precautions have no longer necessary? So those are the things that we'll be looking out for. So the technology and the health things that have happened in the past year are important to see how it's going to pan out. I think what will happen in the future with especially the CCI research is that as data becomes more available and we start getting, if SACO can get the data coming out more accurately and quicker, people are going to spend less time on collecting data and start going more granularly. So start looking at different perceptions. What is happening in different art forms? What is happening in the different disciplines? What is happening in the different areas? So are the rural areas different to the urban areas? So I can see there is going to be a change. The focus is going to change onto new challenges that we're facing, but the people are going to stay the same. People are people, and we'll always have the same wants and desires, and it's just the tools that we've got in our hand. So I do see research improving a lot. Hopefully we will see a lot more students taking up the challenges that Madeleine and the other sponsors, investors will be putting out there, and that we'll see some exciting things happening.
Thank you. There's no doubt that there are massive opportunities that have come forth from challenges. I mean, look at this online conversation and the platform created that is Assembly. So there's pre-recorded things, there's live things, and we're integrating different media streams for us to have a really in-depth conversation and to integrate some of the learnings that we receive, and that's happened over the last few years. Kate, I'd like to ask you, what are some of the ways that you're seeing that research is being produced, and how are these changes being perceived? I guess it's really a question around audience and the different ways that we can start sharing some of the work that's been happening in the creative sector.
Sure. So I think that a lot of the responsibility for initiating a lot of this change comes from organizations like the British Council, who are quite well known for commissioning research. And I think that we can really start to change who's involved in the research. Who do we see as the holders of the wisdom? Who do we see as the people qualified to contribute to the research by relooking at the way that we do monitoring and evaluation? So I think a lot of the statistical background behind monitoring and evaluation is showing impact in numbers, in data. X many people were trained, X many people grew their businesses by X much money in this amount of time. And I think that we can really start to change that by incorporating those people who were previously numbers into the conversation and into the production of the research. And so not just letting that M&E data sit within the organization so that they know how to pivot for the next training or for the next program, but rather to start packaging that information in a way that can be distributed to the sector. And so I think it's about looking at your programs as a collective and starting to track trends between them. And I think it's something that we often don't have time to do. It's why we outsource a lot of our M&E. We don't have time to sit and read those reports, but there's so much rich information there that are sitting in Dropbox files. And so I think that we can really democratize research by making sure that everybody is contributing to it and that it's distributed. And I think that's where a lot of those new voices come in. I think there's also a lot of interesting stuff happening around the funding of research. And so that would be born out of the age-old challenge of a lack of funds to do it. And so research can be incredibly expensive. So how do we look at different ways that we can start to finance it? And so I think one of the opportunities is impact investment, because the creative sector is such a growing economy. And so I think as traditional investors start to acknowledge that, they start to commission really good reports, and they have a lot of the funds to be able to do that, and it helps them make informed investment decisions. But that can be equally as beneficial to everybody else who are designing programs to support the sector beyond just a financial and a social return. But I think that there's also ways that organizations like the British Council, who receive grants every year, can start to think more innovatively about how we're using those grants. So I think that there's always been a bit of a tug of war between, we could just give this money in grants to the sector and get it into the hands of the people who need it, or we could be commissioning research. And so we balance that. So we commission research to help us design more informed and more impactful programs. And so it's been a little bit of a balance. But when you start looking at using that grant, which you were going to just distribute anyway, it was 100% going out with nothing coming in. If you start to think more innovatively around how you manage that financial product, what you could be doing is putting a portion of it towards an impact investment fund that is expecting a certain financial return on investment, as well as the social return you would have got out of the grant anyway, which means that money is going out to organizations, but money also then starts to come in. It starts to be repaid by those businesses over 5-10 years, which frees up additional funding from that grant for research. And so I think that that's a really interesting way that organizations can start to think about how they're using the money that they're getting in.
Fantastic, Kate. I mean, there's so much there, and thank you very much. And I think there's lots of inspiring ideas for us to look at, almost a multiplier effect. So when we're looking at the value of research and how that really informs investment, whether it be impact investment, corporate investment, sponsorship, that's where we're starting to see some of the jewels that can be presented. I mean, I know we just have a few more minutes. I want to open the floor. If anybody has questions for anyone else, or if you are ready to make a closing remark. It's been a very robust conversation, going from the start of research, why we do it, who commissions it, the cost of it, going into how that informs program activity and also gives us a better understanding of each other, especially when we look at transformation and real cultural intelligence and cultural sensitivities. And then, of course, we touched on audience and who receives it. So a very robust conversation indeed. I don't know who wants to start with closing comments or if there's a question for anyone on the panel. Perhaps Madeleine? Dr. Gouws, please go ahead.
Yeah, if I can just add to what Kate says. So we're investing a lot of money, and if we're all investing the money in the wrong place, and what has been happening in South Africa has been doing a lot of supplier development. So we've got a lot of creatives going into the market and perhaps not enough demand for their products. So it's a perverse investment. We're creating expectations that are not necessarily going to be met. So we need to look at the demand side as well. So research is absolutely important. So we can't just carry on putting money into people that are going to benefit from it. We have to make sure that we do spend it correctly and appropriately. The big question Kate and Madeleine might want to answer is what percentage should be spent on monitoring and evaluation and planning as opposed to what goes to the creatives or to the institutions themselves?
A very big question coming at us. Thank you very much for that. And I know in later sessions, we're going to be looking at the value of impact investment. But I do think you ask a very interesting question, especially when we look at research specifically, and that's the M&E question that I know you're quite passionate about, Maddie. So perhaps we start with you and then to you, Kate, Dr. Gouws' question.
Thank you. Yeah, that is a very tough question to answer. And I think, like everything in the creative and cultural sector, you know, we don't really have specific standards. And particularly in terms of monitoring and evaluation having been something that's been somewhat of a neglected area in the sector for a long period of time. It's quite hard to establish that. And I think it depends from organization to organization and project to project. Because some organizations like BASA have in-house M&E capacity and research capacity. So there is a certain amount that we can do ourselves. And for larger projects, then we look to outsource and partner with other organizations. But certainly for smaller organizations and organizations who are particularly struggling with funding, because that's another issue. A lot of the funding for the sector is specifically for project funding and doesn't go towards operational costs and staffing costs. So that creates a whole other layer to the challenge. You know, they tend to have to spend more, and it's more difficult for them to access the kinds of resources needed to produce that data. So I'm not sure that I can come back with a specific percentage to answer that question, but it is tricky, and I think it depends on also the complexity of the project, because a project that's located in one province will require less of an M&E budget than something that's happening nationally or across borders. So yeah, it can be very difficult, and I think for those trying to plan budgets and plan programming budgets to work those research and M&E costs into their forecasting and their planning, what I would say is to try and partner with universities, as I mentioned earlier, because sometimes students do have a particular interest in an organization's work and they might be willing and able to incorporate it into their own studies somehow. But to look at what comparable organizations are doing. And I think, again, it's a challenge because we tend to be quite competitive in the sector, and I think we need to be more open to sharing information and collaborating so that we can learn from each other. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my stab at it.
I think what percent is the $1 million question. Dr. Gouws, if you don't mind me rephrasing that question slightly for Kate, when it comes to M&E and as program managers, we do this all the time, right, Kate? I mean, we ask these questions: what does this program wish to achieve? Where is M&E built into program design? I mean, is it something that comes right at the end? Kate, you did mention earlier the rush that we sometimes have in projects, and you know, the time to really look at research and really integrate it and really use it. So to maybe answer the monitoring and evaluation question from your perspective, and particularly that in designing program.
Sure. So monitoring and evaluation can't be something that's tagged on at the end. If you are expecting to do a similar program a number of times and you want it to be an informed and impactful program, you need to learn on what you've already learn based on what you've already done. So you've got to be building. You've got to be building on M&E all the time. And so I think it's something that you build into the design of the program upfront. And I think to not even attempt to answer Dr. Gouws' question, but to potentially just make it more complicated, I think not only how much time or how much budget should be spent on M&E as a percentage of a program budget, but actually who should be carrying the cost of that and who should be carrying the time. And I find that as research institutions, what we often do is put a lot of the burden of M&E actually on the participants that we're working with, on the people who are receiving the grants or participants of the program. And it's really unfair, especially on them as small organizations. I think to touch on also what Madeleine was saying is that they are small organizations and they don't have the capacity to do a lot of what we're asking them to do. And so they take on the burden of that and they're having to employ additional people to run programs, M&E for them. And so that's really unfair. And so I think it's something that needs to be decided in collaboration with those that you're working with. So you sit down together and you decide what is your M&E framework going to look like. And what we've started to do in some of our programs is have a project budget, say a grant project that they've asked for a specific amount. And we'll actually build on a little bit extra and say, this is the money to buy your time to participate in our extensive M&E. So we're gonna pay for an extra 2 days a month so that you have the capacity to do what we're asking. And so I think that that's a much fairer way to take on this kind of work, but it is something that I think has to be negotiated. I think what it can't be is funders coming in and saying, you know, if you want this money, we get all your time in return. I think that it's something that has to be a negotiation and a decision that's taken as a partnership.
I love that. And I loved what you said earlier about democratizing research. And, you know, the idea is an approach might combat a lot of slack that research gets, or particularly M&E gets, when it comes to information mining that sometimes participants feel. So organizations would give very small grants and then expect hours and hours and hours of interview and to try and find out where it went to. As we close, is there any closing comments from anybody? I know we've taken this conversation to lots of various depths and lots of separate parts. And I think research is what's really inspiring, and what I've come out of this conversation with is that, you know, it is a lot of movable parts. It's not the sum of it. Research isn't something stagnant or static or coming in at the end. Whilst expensive, it can also be very expensive to not. Kate Gardner, Dr. André Gouws, and Madeleine Lambert, thank you so much for joining me in a rather robust conversation about research and investment. Thank you very much for having us and for joining us as well.